Hi, everyone. Jamluti here, and welcome to the Africa Traveler podcast. Today, we've got an amazing guest. His name is Kingsley Holgate. I'm sure you've heard of him. Kingsley is a very difficult man to introduce, but he's probably the most traveled man in Africa. I've had the honor of getting to know him over the last few years, and he very kindly has agreed to come on the show this morning. So, Kingsley, thank you so much for being here. I know you've been away a while. It's good to have you back. How are you, and where have you been, and what have you been doing?
How are you, John Luther? Good to chat to you after quite a long time away. So yes, and glad things are going well for you. It's good for us to be home again, I must say, Jamrut. A year away, 62,000 kilometers, land rovering between 22 African parks, more than 20 million hectares under protection. It was a journey all about community, conservation, and, of course, culture, the African way. So good to be home and good to be alive. Some challenges, I must say. But, just good to know that conservation is, in many parts of Africa, still strong, and there's lots of hope. So if I had to answer your question with one sentence or so, we've come back with great stories of hope.
I mean, it astounds me. You say like you just rattle that off as if you went for a drive to the supermarket. I mean, this isn't your first journey of this type. And so how on earth did you get started? How do you build a career that it allows you to do what you? I mean, where did you get started in all of this?
Jamnut, it's a question often asked, like, so, what's behind it all and how did you get started? And the phrase we use, which is a phrase from the heart, is it's all about a passion and a love for this continent, for Mama Africa. And we know that Mama Africa can be all good and all bad, all at the same time. But our message is always one of hope and always seeking the good. So really, that's how we got. I guess I was fortunate, the youngest of three boys, traveled all over Africa with my missionary teacher family. And I guess that might have sown the seed, sitting on my dad's lap, talking about the early explorers, Livingstone, Stanley, Burton, Speke, all these colorful characters. Might have got the seed sown for future adventures. But it's been a wonderful life of adventure, some 30, 40 years of traveling Africa, and the huge privilege of having traveled and adventured in every single country on the African continent. So we're privileged. It's all about our passion for this beautiful continent of Mama Africa, Jeff.
It's incredibly inspiring, Kingsley. And you've actually written a number of books. You've written 5 books, I think. What are those books about? And what is that sort of? Tell us a little bit about that.
Well, maybe by talking briefly about the books would give the viewer, the listener, an idea of where these travels have taken us. I remember the first book was very simplistically written, like they all were, just words taken from the scribbles in the old sweat-stained expedition journals. And the first one was simply called Cape to Cairo. It was a story of taking open boats all the way from the Cape of Good Hope through to the mouth of the Nile, Alexandria in Egypt. So, wow. What was important about it was South Africa, after its days of bad politics, the release of Mandela, that great man, and a new wind of opportunity blowing across Africa. So there we took off in these 2 open boats, inflatable boats, all the way from Cape Town to Cairo. And it just opened up our hearts to Africa. And we felt for the first time that we were becoming citizens of this greater continent. And I remember all those years ago arriving in Cairo. South Africa had been admitted into the world by that time. And just this feeling that we are part of this moment, the releasing of Nelson Mandela, a true democracy, and marching into Africa, not as a conquest, but as children of Mama Africa. And it was a great journey. And that's what sort of set us off on this mission. So that book was Cape to Cairo. I might not have these books in order necessarily. Another one was called Africa in the Footsteps of the Great Explorers. We spent over a decade following in the footsteps of and this particular book was all about David Livingstone. It was about Burton Speke, Stanley. But what I do remember about this book in particular was it was about the brave, unsung African heroes of exploration. And recount that we dedicated the book to Chuma and Susi, those 2 brave hearts who, when Livingstone died, carried his body all the way across Africa, all the way down to Bagamoyo opposite Zanzibar. And I remember how, because it's an African story, how we were amazed that when Livingstone's body was sent over to England and he was buried, minus his heart, which was placed in an old biscuit tin under a mapundu tree in present-day Zambia, how the two guys, Chuma and Susi, who he'd saved from slavery all those years ago, weren't at the funeral in Westminster Abbey. There was pallbearers, there was Henry Morton Stanley was there, members of the Royal Geographical Society. But these two African bravehearts weren't there to be recognized at that time. So when we took off from there, we went around the world in 2 Land Rovers, and obviously we called those Land Rovers Chuma and Susi, as recognition for these bravehearts. So that was another book. That was Africa in the Footsteps of the Great Explorers. We talked about Cape to Cairo. Another book was simply called Dispatches from the Outside Edge, a journey to track the entire outline of Africa. It took 449 days, 33 countries. And what was great about it, as in all our expeditions, we carry a scroll, it's like a big Melville and Moon produced canvas and leather book. You've seen them in the past. And that was inscribed a full page by Nelson Mandela, Archbishop Desmond Tutu. And the entire journey was about malaria prevention. Mums with kids trying to put help end this disease that kills so many mums and children in Africa. So, that was a great book, Dispatches from the Outside Edge, a year-long journey. So many memories from that. So how many have I done? I've done Cape to Cairo. I've done Dispatches from the Outside Edge. We've talked about the following in the footsteps of the early explorers and all those adventures. And then, there was another crazy one. It was called Following the Invisible Line. And the invisible line in this case was 23 degrees 27. The Tropic of Capricorn that goes around the world on that latitude. Yeah. And, sort of joining the old supercontinent of Gondwanaland and all the adventures of what it took to go around the world following the Tropic of Capricorn. And that, I think, takes us to 4 books, and it's a chance of reliving our journeys with you, Jamlut. And then the last book is simply called Africa, A Love Affair with a Continent. And it embraces all the journeys that it took to adventure in every country on our beautiful continent, and also what it was like to visit the 7 poles, namely, the most southerly point, the most westerly point in Senegal, the most northerly point in Tunisia, and of course, the dangers and the trials and tribulations of getting to the most easterly point, extreme east, in Somalia. Yeah. And then, of course, the lowest point, Lake Assal in Djibouti, the highest point, Kilimanjaro. Yeah. And then a great adventure, of course, to locate the geographic center of the African continent. Canada has theirs, America has theirs, the world has their central points, these various countries. But good old Mama Africa, the center point hadn't been documented yet. So with coordinates given to us by the International Geographic Society, off we went into the jungles of Central Africa, 200 kilometers of rainforest. And, my size and my age, not really meant for that sort of thing. So we had with us 14 Bahaka pygmies, wonderful little characters, and it nearly killed me. It was really, really tough. But finally we screwed a beacon into the geographic center point of Mama Africa. And in keeping with your love, Jamlut, for conservation and Africa's wild spaces, on this beacon that we placed at the geographic center of Mama Africa was inscribed a small forest elephant. And apart from the geographic coordinates and the flags of the countries, it was all about using this journey to talk and educate and explore stories around the forest elephant of Africa. And thereafter we went to, hundreds of schools doing elephant art with all the kids and spread the good message. So that was the book that was that's part of this. There's many stories in this. It's a monster. I say to people, don't fall asleep with this book on your chest. You could not wake up. It's so heavy, but it just colorfully relates all the journeys taken over the last 30 years across Africa. So I trust that gives you a bit of a feel of some of the journeys. I mean, another one discussed in this book, Africa, A Love Affair with a Continent, what it was like to sail an old Arab sailing dhow, lateen rig sail corked with palm nut oil and strips of cotton and big down nails and creaking decks, sailing all the way, a journey that took us from Durban all the way to the Somali border and back, and using that journey to spread the good word about conservation, the need to conserve our ecosystems, our biodiversity, and more importantly, in this case, it was all about, once again, malaria prevention to mums and kids. So there are so many wonderful journeys that, I must say, make us feel so privileged. Yeah. We never take it for granted, and it's been a wonderful privilege.
I find it, just listening, you've crammed a lifetime of adventure into a few minutes there, and find it incredible. I think for the average person, any single day out of one of those journeys would have been an experience of a lifetime, and you must have so much perspective on what Africa is, and what it isn't. And I pick up through the books and the journeys that you've carried out that there's always been a humanitarian aspect to it. You mentioned malaria prevention quite a lot, but your recent tour was a conservation-focused tour. Do you see a difference between humanitarian work and conservation work, or how do you feel like they overlap? I'd really like to hear your perspective on that in the context of your most recent expedition.
Yeah, Jamloot, it's everything is so interconnected. It's a wheel, And yes, we do concentrate on a lot of malaria work. Fortunately, that is supported by Land Rover, and we really appreciate that support for this work. And of course, the Nando's organization get flat out behind this malaria work. They call that organization Goodbye Malaria. So yeah, we've been doing it really for most of our lives. And the malaria work started not because we suddenly sat down one day and thought, let's form an NGO and do some good and have an office and all that. So it didn't start like that. It started with somebody dying from malaria in the Land Rover. It started with like a thud to the heart when you get to a village and a mother screaming and a little baby in a coma, and it's 100 kilometers or so down a river by a dugout canoe to get to the nearest clinic, and then there they might not have the treatment. And so it was from personal experiences. I'm talking to you on this podcast, and I've had malaria more than 60 times. So yeah, it was just those personal experiences that made us feel the need to distribute malaria prevention nets and to do malaria prevention education, indoor residual spraying with Goodbye Malaria, good stuff in fighting malaria. And what is really, our role has been very small, just a grain of sand. Had I been talking to you 2-3 years ago, a child was dying for every minute of the day around the clock. And now it's like every 3 minutes. Not that that's a really good barometer to use, but you sense that, yes, we can win this fight against malaria. Yeah. The other humanitarian cause we'll get to discussing how these are all linked to conservation and the communities alongside conservation areas is, of course, right to cite the provision of reading glasses to poor-sighted, mostly elderly people. Something that in the Western world, Jamloot, we so take for granted. You go into an optician's shop or a pharmacy and you look into that little mirror and you get yourself a 1.75 or 2.25, whatever the strength might be, and you can see again, because 90% of people's eye problems around the world is just purely that, just the ability to have a pair of reading glasses and improves one's lifestyle, give a better quality of life. So we've done about 260,000 pairs to date, and the instant gratification of the recipient is just so lovely. There's an old Maasai woman on the boundaries of the Masai Mara Game Reserve near the Serengeti, these wonderful wildlife places, and there she makes a living from doing bead work. Yeah. And now she can't see. And, you do the tests, you get the right strength, and the grin on her face as she's able to take a bead needle and thread and see a blue bead, a green, a red, an orange, and string them together again. And the people standing with her all applaud, yay, that mama's got her life back, she's got her dignity back, and just for a simple pair of reading glasses. That's just another one of our causes. And then, of course, on the conservation front, you asked that question, how does that humanitarian work link to conservation? Well, it's at the key, because what we have found out from this journey that we've just completed and from many other journeys and time spent with you in the past is that if we don't practice good neighborliness between communities and conservation, then surely we are doomed.
Yeah.
These conservation spaces can't just be seen for elitists. The populations around them need to feel part of conservation. They need to benefit from it. The land, after all, is theirs. So this link of conservation to communities is absolutely key to the work we do. For example, on this recent journey, Jamlook, you would have loved it. 62,000 kilometers by Land Rover, linking all 22 African parks. African Parks is a non-profit organization that takes over parks with no hope, no future, parks that are virtually destroyed. And with governments and other organizations as partners, then they rehabilitate these parks. We didn't know what we would find before taking off on this massive journey to link all these parks. And as I mentioned before, it's over 20 million hectares under protection. And the areas one goes to are vast and far spread. This journey took us to South Sudan, for example, where finally the largest migration of mammals in the world has just been officially counted. It's over 6 million. So when one talks of the Serengeti migration, 1.35 million for the gazelle and the zebras, everything else. And then you end up in a place it seems impossible in this day and age. And when people talk about hope for Africa and the reason to visit Africa, can you imagine 6 million antelope on the move? And so this journey uncovered so many secrets. It included getting to the north of Benin, up against the two parks, west, as it's called, or W, and the other one, Penjari. That was our penultimate park that we visited. Right in the north there, a bit of a jihadist threat, so, we had to travel carefully. But there, the effort that African Parks is putting into saving the last of the West African lions from extinction, and then seeing those West African elephants and realizing that sometimes this job of conservation comes at such a cost to people's lives, the effort it takes, the dedication, wow. And then the last park we visited was in the Central African Republic. Few people go there. From Bangui, taking a light aircraft all the way to Chinko. To give you an idea, it's 1.5 times the size of the Kruger National Park. Do you know that there's one river alone, 400 kilometers without a human being, not a dugout canoe, not a fisherman? These vast pieces of Africa. That's where Africa sets itself apart from other continents. Of course, because of our love for it, but also just this kaleidoscope of color and music and culture and wildlife and sunsets and panoramas. So coming back from this journey with so much hope. Matusadona in Zimbabwe, all but destroyed. Rangers hadn't been paid for years. And now the Rangers camp has been fenced against the elephants, been painted up, their houses, the schools, the murals. We helped with the painting of murals and everything. Just so much hope across Africa. And there is a sort of, sadly, a common belief that Africa's wild spaces are destroyed. But 22 parks, 60,000 k's across Africa, going all the way to the north of Chad, into the Sahara, to Enedi, up against the Libyan border. What about Zakuma, that sort of southeastern part of Chad, where it's an absolute wildlife miracle. Where we're sitting there now, there'd be 2.5 million red-billed quellias. We'd have quarter-fan giraffe walking through this haze of bird life. Elephants, thousands of buffalo. So we need to remind ourselves that Africa is still full of hope. And of course, the work with the community is so important. And I was just so pleased to see the amount of community work, the positive stuff that is being done by African parks in these various wildlife areas, wildlife spaces across Africa. And I'll just give you one example. At Majeti in the south of Malawi, I said to the ranger in charge, I said, "Sir, tell me, I'm absolutely amazed that you haven't lost a single elephant or rhino to poaching in 20 years. What is the size of your intelligence network out there?" And he came back and he said, it's 186,000 people. I said, no, you might not understand the question. How how many people in your intelligence network that you can control the poaching to this extent.
Yeah.
And he said, no, you don't understand. It's a community of 186,000 people.
Yeah.
We build schools, soccer games, cultural events. We make them part of this park. We bring 5,000 children a year into our educational camps. And it was so great there and all the other parks and the work that we've been doing for so many years, Jeff, and that is in the field of conservation art. So we take an A3 piece of paper. It's a very simple passport to speak to kids. And there's an outline of several animals. And these young artists get to paint and draw and color these images. And more importantly, they write a paragraph of two of what they think about conservation and the future for conservation. What do they think about the senseless killing of rhinos, the senseless nature of shooting elephants for their ivory? What do these kids think? And it's absolutely amazing. With Grant Poles from Project Rhino, I know he's an old friend of yours, we've been able to take this art program to close to 1 million children across Africa. And on this journey, once again, taking that art and looking at the color and message and from the kids, it's just so important. And I'll just end this little piece by saying this need to teach kids more about wildlife stems from that iconic conservationist the late Dr. Ian Blair, who did so much to save the southern white rhinos. And I remember we invited Ian. He was sort of quite sick at that time. He was getting to his last days. And I remember we flew him in by helicopter to Umfolozi, the game reserve in Zululand in South Africa. And I remember Ian Player on the old bush airstrip there at Umfolozi, sitting talking to 300 kids that we'd brought from around the world, from Southeast Asia, from China, from Vietnam, from all over the world. All these kids sitting there on that day. And there he was in his wheelchair, and he spoke so beautifully. And everybody shed a tear. Yeah. But the message that he left with us is pretty clear. We haven't done a great job for conservation in our lives. He said, hand the baton of conservation over to the youth. And if we don't work with the youth in conservation and the communities alongside our national parks, then surely conservation is doomed. So, we took that as a statement from a legend, and that really stimulated and pushed us forward. Whenever we think this is a lot of work and who's going to pay for it and how are we going to do it, don't give up hope. One of the greatest men in conservation said, share the baton of conservation. Give the baton of conservation over to the youth. They are the future. So, so much fun, Jamlut, and all these journeys. But yes, stories of hope for conservation. Africa is not doomed. Its wild spaces are.
Yeah. I'm getting a very positive sort of resonance from your experience. And in the back of my mind, I'm wondering, so when you began traveling Africa, I don't know when that was exactly, but let's say, 40, 50 years ago? Global population was a lot less. I imagine the impact of industry on our natural world may have been less, but we also were not as knowledgeable about conservation as what we are now. So I'm wondering, from your perspective, what is the state of, you've seen more of Africa than probably anyone. And maybe it's a very difficult question to answer, but from your perspective, what is the state of Africa now in terms of its humanitarian state and conservation compared to 50 years ago? Would you say we're going backwards, we're treading water, we're improving? How do you see that?
Well, I think in a lot of wild spaces and a lot of conservation spaces, in many areas, it has gone backwards. And now there's a revival. So yes, as I said, this journey that we've just done, getting to parks, to wildlife areas that were all but destroyed. I remember getting to Rwanda, for example, after the genocide, Akagera, their big five park. So, the lions had been poisoned and shot. The elephants were all but gone. There were far more snares than there were animals. There was a huge demand for the returnees after peace had come to Rwanda after the genocide. So a big section of the park had to be fenced off and given over to the people. And I must say, it felt as if there was no hope, possibly. I remember doing an interview with Jess, the regional manager for that park, Rwanda, those parks in Rwanda, the 2 parks that African Parks runs there. And I said, Jess, what was it like when you first set foot in Akagera in Rwanda? He just shook his head and he said, it wasn't mayhem. It was as if there was no hope.
Yeah.
And then I look at it now. It's a big 5 park. They brought in rhino from South Africa. The elephants are still a bit cheeky. Why? Because they remember the war years.
Yeah.
It's just absolutely beautiful. And what's amazing, we talk about stories for hope. So there's a park that had all but gone. And now it's flourishing. And what I'd like to share with you, Jamloti, is that it's I think 96% sustainable. 46% of the people that visit the park are local Rwandese. They come to the lodges, they camp, they visit.
Yes.
Huge numbers of school children that visit that park. As I said, it's close to 100% sustainable. But what amazed me, not was just the return of the wildlife and the exceptional management and the law enforcement and how it starts at the top. It starts with the president. It starts with political will. And in Rwanda, you have that.
Yeah.
And so what I was amazed, around the park was all the community work. Was just quite incredible. There was fish farming, there was agriculture, there was schools. It just the employment that had been provided by the park, the job opportunities, and the number of cooperatives. This is what really I found to be fantastic. I remember in their other park, the rainforest park, the tropical rainforest park of Nyungwe, the road through those beautiful forests. I think you've adventured to that part of the world. I seem to remember, but the road through those beautiful forests, takes you down to Burundi and across to the Congo. So there are a number of trucks, quite dangerous. There are all those curves going through this beautiful forest. And of course, the truck drivers were just stopping and doing their ablutions on the side of the road in the forest. So how about this for, just good neighborliness from people living in and around these parts? The women of the area got together and they said, we're going to form a toilet cooperative. A toilet cooperative on the side of the roads. Lovely built, beautifully built little toilets with wash hand basin and everything. So much for a poo, so much for a wee. The whole area is now spotless. The roads are clean and the mums have a cooperative, a toilet cooperative. But there's so many other cooperatives. And you look at, if conservation is part of the communities around those parts, the essential nature of that. I remember speaking to a young Rwandese girl. She was about 30, big smile, little sort of Rasta hairstyle and big grin. And I said, so what are you doing? She said, I'm building the best forest conservation headquarters in the world. She said, come with me. Gumboots, treading through the mud. She said, let me introduce you to the brick-making cooperative. There was like 50, 60 guys, huge muscles, mechanically making bricks on a big brick-making machine. And she said, this is the brick-making cooperative. We agree on the number of bricks. They get paid by phone every 2 weeks. And it's their cooperative, it's their business, it's registered with the government and it pays tax. And so every other aspect of this building was all through cooperatives. The Norwegians had planted trees in the forest long before the time of the genocide, and now these were great big trees in the wrong place. So there was a timber cooperative, cutting these trees down by hand, putting them on bullock carts, dragging them through the forest, the indigenous forest, doing a great job for conservation, at the same time providing all the beams and the flooring and everything for that. So she said, that's why this will be the most beautiful forest conservation park headquarters. Why? Because it's built by the people. And so that just, wow, that just gave us so much hope, for conservation. And yes, so if we take out the community work, Jamlut, which you know so well, it's not right. These wild spaces must not just be seen for exclusive foreign travel and everything. They have to also be for the people of Africa and for job creation and everything else goes with it. So, good stories about involving the communities alongside the park and stories of hope for our beautiful continent.
It's interesting that you bring up this idea of a lot of locals going into parks and saying that they make the park so sustainable. As you know, I wear two hats. And on one hand, I help to get funding or investment for conservation projects throughout Africa. All right. So there's always this, we get stuck in the nitty gritty of the financials and valuing of shares and trying to create green bonds and all sorts of fancy things. And whenever we are talking about the funding or financing of conservation projects, there's always, well, how's this thing going to make money? And this brings me to the other hat that I wear, in that I promote and high-end travel to Africa. All right. So what you were referring to as the elitist part of travel. I have a bit of a different perspective, and I'd like to hear your thoughts on it. So, for example, there's a lot of very expensive lodges in Africa where the impact is minimal in terms of its tourism, a minimum impact, maximum income. So this is the way that I sort of is ingrained in me as to how we solve the conservation finance problem. You're saying that it's important to bring local tourists into parks. What is your view on sort of the elitist, high-end, expensive aspect as opposed to the local people coming in?
Jamlut, I think it's a mixture of both. I think to have both is absolutely essential. And to bring in the high-end tourists, mostly international, into these beautiful wildlife spaces and let them go home and tell these stories of hope is really important. You can't get away from the importance of tourism revenues to sustain these parks. I've just come back from Gorongosa, for example, in Mozambique, with some upmarket, well-heeled safari guests. And not only were they amazed at the wildlife, 75,000 water buck, a beautiful lodge, very knowledgeable game drivers, wonderful, just such a wonderful space, and the beauty of the area. And of course, that marks the end of the Great African Rift Valley. Every guest put money. It was part of their fee. Every guest put money back into the conservation work being done with the communities at Gorongosa. Now, there's an example of how, well-heeled, knowledgeable tourists, the right sort of safari clients, that not only visit an area, but they help sustain it through their interest by leaving where they can, some funding behind. None of these visits that we do with these, and I don't really like the word elitist groups, but if we just call them that for a moment, is the importance of when on safari with these people, that you include them in the conservation community, in the communities. I remember on this recent journey to Gorongosa, we went to schools, the girls' clubs, the wonderful work they do. We became part of all of that as a part of the visit. And then up Gorongosa Mountain, where the mountain has been saved by planting coffee under the shade trees. And, that was a Renamo rebel headquarters, and now it's at peace. And if you destroy that mountain, it's the watershed for that magnificent park. So taking one's guests up into that mountain, into the mists and the rain, realizing that's a watershed for an entire ecosystem. And then for them to be part of the tree planting, coffee needs 40% shade. The individuals that get these coffee seedlings, hundreds of them, to restore this mountain, their lives have changed. Before, they're only on bicycles or on foot, and now they're on little motorbikes. And there's even a coffee factory, and there's even a coffee brand called Gorongosa Coffee. The mountain is being rehabilitated. The coffee is holding back the soil. Heavy rains. And the shade trees, indigenous trees, restoring the area to it. So, yes, the guests, the sort of tourists you're talking about, were exposed not only to the wildlife, not only to the beautiful lodge, not only to the beautifully prepared food and everything else, but also to the good work that happens. And then They felt part of all of that. They realized that it's not just about the wildlife, it's about everything that sustains that wildlife and makes it possible. So that was just a very, very recent example.
Yeah.
The importance of high-end travel, the importance of them telling this positive story internationally, and the importance of not only the tourism revenue, which is in many cases the survival of the entire area is based sometimes on tourism revenue.
Yeah.
And so let's encourage that those groups to visit Africa. The work that you do in terms of doing just that, and you've been doing that for many years. But let's share this beautiful continent with the right sort of people who have a genuine interest in Africa, who can leave something behind and can take away with them stories of hope for Mama Africa, positive stories. So yes, I think it's a mixture of both. We need the local people to visit the parks, and yes, we do need tourism. You know, all the strata of tourism to bring revenue to these parks, absolutely key. And you know, there's so many gems out there that are virtually undiscovered. And at some stage, I'd love to share a list of these places with you where you could take guests to, and it would give them a unique experience that's not over tourisized.
Yeah.
Something where you're not sharing a leopard up a tree with a load of other people and vehicles. So many genuine experiences still to be had in Africa, and our time has come to share it with others.
I had a conversation recently with a large international hotel group who is looking at venturing into the luxury lodge sector in Africa. And I was speaking to the person who is heading up this part of their business. And he was asking me about what is the difference between a success and a not a success in this field. And I said to him that what is not going to work is if you pretend to do good. If you write nice text and release press releases in order to look good, but you don't actually do good. I think it's very strange in the tourism sector, specifically in the lodge sector in Africa, in that there's a burden on tourism to also take care of the humanitarian aspect and the conservation aspect. If you think about it, this burden is not placed on any other part of the hospitality or hotel industry. I don't really have a question. I'm just trying to make a point and maybe hear your view on that. Is that the tourism or the hotel industry within Africa has always sort of had this burden that it's had to carry because it's the only viable income stream for conservation and in rural communities around these projects. It's a pretty difficult thing to do. Yeah. As I said, I don't really have a question. It was more of a statement, and maybe to hear your view on that. And do you think that I'm right in thinking that, or where else does funding come from for these projects?
Well, I think that funding can come from various sources. We're talking sort of more principally tourism here, and there is no doubt that if big business moves into these areas, wanting tourism revenues and obviously needing to be a success, it's very important. Creating jobs, hugely, hugely important. And you know, the creation of jobs and training for people from the surrounding areas is as key as doing humanitarian work. And just the job creation and the training. So if a hotel group moves in and they employ 100 people and train them up and give them opportunities and opportunities that then can take them on into other parts of the country. So just that alone, just the job opportunity aspect is so key. But, you know, my personal thing is I do prefer the smaller, sort of more personal type of intimate lodges to give people more of a real experience. But yes, a lot of these wildlife areas do have hotel type developments on the outskirts of the lodges. And if they move in with the right attitude about, yes, we can do business here, we can make a lot of people happy. At the same time, let's do really good stuff for the community. And I think that should be stated in advance of a developer like that moving in, that, you know, part of this is that you are going to have to support communities in and around the park. I think that's absolutely necessary.
I couldn't agree with you more. And I don't support large hotels in rural areas or in and so on. But yeah, I'm fully on board with very small but high end. People must pay for that privilege in order to enjoy privacy, which is, I think, the ultimate luxury is to have that. I wanted to get back to something else that we spoke about earlier. You were saying when you met Ian Player on that airfield, and he was sitting in his wheelchair. I'm not comparing you to Ian Player, but a year or two older than I am. Yeah. If you were to give that same advice now, what would you say? If you were handing over the baton, I had this conversation with Grant Folds recently on a podcast I did with him, and he also had an interesting answer. But I'd love to hear your take on that. If you were advising the youth of today or the next generation, what do you say? What needs to be done?
Well, I think where possible, we must get as many young people as possible to visit wildlife areas and connect with wilderness and nature, to sit around a campfire, to share the sounds of the wild, to walk with the wild. And I think the more youngsters, young people, they can actually have those experiences, Africa will then do the magic on them. But if they aren't able to experience wild Africa, how are they going to participate in its future with real understanding? So that's why we do enjoy the conservation art, because the winners then go to a wildlife camp. They get to walk with rhinos in the wild, and they go back to their little schools as wildlife ambassadors. But yes, to answer your question, we need to expose more young people to these experiences. Lads and dads getting together, sitting around a campfire at night, listening to stories from local legends, Africans sitting around the fire with us, learning a few words of an African language. Let them feel Africa in their hearts, and it'll change them. But, we do live in a world of, it's more important to spend time on your laptop or on your iPhone, and the danger is not connecting with wilderness. And the same Dr. Ian Player, in one of his books, wrote about the incredible importance of connecting regularly with the wilderness that's in your heart. And until you experience those great wilderness, a lot of people can't. They simply don't have the funds to do so. But the more we can do to help children reconnect or connect with the wild spaces of Africa, the stories, the legends, the experiences, rhinos, elephants, what this does to the youth, they'll talk about it for the rest of their lives. So, yeah, you need tourism. We need to bring people in from all over the world, but we need also our own kids, the children of Africa, to get to experience these places more often. And of course, that's a challenge. And, you ask, how could tourism help in that way? Can you imagine if a tourist lodge organization said, we'll do X number of wildlife camps for kids a year? Just that. Imagine the difference that would make.
I'm actually always astounded by the lack of access from surrounding communities. I was in the Makgadikgadi a couple of years ago, and I was staying at the only high-end lodge that's there. And they've got a lot of the land that they traverse on belongs to local community. And when I visited, we did a trip into the local town, which is called Kumaka. And we were introduced to the headman of the town, this gentleman, who wore a stunning white suit and a beautiful hat. He said he's the one who said to me that he's got a head for hats, and that's always kind of stayed with me. And I invited him to come with us on the game drive into the and it was the first time that he had been invited. And it's the first time that he had gone. And that was astounding to me, how little locals have access. So I'm fully on board with what you say, that there should be a lot more local interaction and access to these pristine areas.
Yes, and
yeah.
Sorry, Dominic.
No, you carry on.
Carry on.
No, I'm done. You carry on.
And what we should also realize is it's great fun.
Yeah.
It's great fun.
Yeah.
To connect with the traditional people, the indigenous cultures of the areas, to share their wildlife knowledge, for them to be able to come into the parks. And I said, it's also such good fun. it shouldn't be seen as a burden.
Yeah.
Because it's just really, really good fun. So yeah, I hope that in your development of you taking guests into Africa, I know you've been doing it for many years, but I know it's something that you will embrace. The cultural side.
Yeah. Yeah.
The cultural side of communities alongside these wildlife areas. Wow, it's not all done in a single lifetime. I'm 78 now, 78 years young, and I just look at these up and coming generations. Populations explode as the pressure on these wildlife areas gets more extreme. If these wildlife areas are not working with communities, and if they're not giving something back to those communities alongside the parks, if they're not offering employment, well, then they will not be true partners in these areas. Yeah. So it can be great fun. It can be challenging.
Yeah.
But yes, just to, Mama Africa has got a soul. And people from all over the world that visit these magical places feel it.
Yeah.
It is a continent like no other in that regard. And so I appeal people to visit. Please spend your dollars or pounds or euros here in this beautiful continent. And when you're doing it, ensure as best you can that you're leaving something. You've been part of this legacy of handing over conservation to the next generation. And I just think it's a beautiful, pass over the baton to the youth, pass over the baton of conservation to the communities. And I know, Jamnut, you're doing a good work in that regard. And so, keep it up. It's great stuff.
Thank you, man. I really appreciate that. I'm going to ask you a horrible question, one that I would hate to be asked.
Yeah.
What does the world look like to you in the year 2100 in terms of its natural state? Are you an optimist?
Yeah, it's difficult.
Are you pessimistic about it?
I am very aware of the challenges, and I'm glad you're saying the wild spaces, because if we look at the world today and what's happening at this very moment around the world in the various war zones, it's quite frightening. But from a wilderness perspective, it will work into the future if people invest into it. If people remain dedicated, like this journey I've just done with African parks, if you must not, we and future generations must not take their foot off the accelerator. It has to be worked at constantly. And if these wild spaces provide employment and hope and opportunities for the people around them and do well from their tourism and other revenue sources, then they will survive. But otherwise, I fear for their future. The part that I've just seen in this journey and the 22 wildlife properties, places, destinations visited. I carried a big book, sort of made by Melvin and that do all those fancy canvas and leather luggage, and it's a great big book. We mentioned it before. But in this case, it was endorsed by thousands. People cutting the trail paths in the rainforests, by law enforcement, by rangers, by the cooks, by grass cutters, by drivers, by rangers, by park managers in French, English, Swahili, Portuguese, Angola, Mozambique. And initially, this journey was to be called Africa Odyssey. It still was called Africa Odyssey. The byline was culture, community, and conservation. And we never knew what we would discover. But a couple of weeks ago, on handing that book with these 1,000 images and messages, by that time we'd had to add another 100 pages. It's huge. But handing that book over to the CEO of African Parks, I said, I wish I was in a position where we could have handed you over several $1 million. But we can't. We're a bunch of adventurers. So what we can hand over is a story of hope. And we handed over this scroll of hope for conservation with all these positive messages by local people. We mustn't give up. We must keep on. We need to protect these areas. Who for? for future generations.
Yeah.
And that will live with me. As I handed over Peter Fernand had tears in his eyes, and the gratitude that we saw there, and the endorsement of stories of hope for conservation in Africa. Yeah. So, let's not give up. To answer your question, hope for the future, I believe, will only happen if we keep up the hard work and make these places work for everybody.
Yeah. Amazing. Yeah, sure. You make me hopeful, Kingsley. Last question. If I were to say to you, where should I go in Africa on my next trip? What would you tell me?
Sure. It's a really difficult one because there's so much. I have a personal love for East Africa, the wild spaces of Tanzania, touching on Kenya, Uganda. I love the Swahili culture, the terms of respect, the way people are treated. It's just a lovely language and a lovely culture. So I do have a personal love there with East Africa. But then again, what about those countries close to us? Zambia. I mean, I've just spent quality time. African Parks has just taken over Kafui. And, they were explaining how when they first flew over that vast landscape, 1.5 times the size of Kruger, one of the biggest parks in Africa, how when they first flew over it, just a couple of years ago, it was a spider's web of bush paths with permanent poaching villages within the park.
Yeah.
And bicycles were coming and bringing goods and taking out poached bushmeat. Taking it to military camps, taking it to the copper belt, taking it to restaurants down in Lusaka. And then I see African Parks come in this case, sort out the law enforcement, grade the roads, make sure the rangers are paid in time, the proper vehicles, and it happens quickly. A lodge owner there who'd been there, I think, some 16 years, he said it in these words. He said, "I'm not a scientist, but since we have now got hope again for this wild space, you can feel it by the actions and behavior of the animals, of the wild animals." He said, "Look at this." And he showed me a little video clip that had been taken from the night before where a leopard had come into the lounge in the early hours of the morning, had jumped onto a table where there was a small statue of a leopard made from little mapani chips. And this leopard sort of, in abeyance, sort of went down in front of this little sculpture. I mean, walked around the lounge and then just strolled off into the darkness.
Amazing.
Did you see there's hope?
Yeah.
If we can bring organization back to these areas, then there's hope for the future.
Yeah.
I mean, you've seen it. You've seen the development of these places across Africa.
Yeah.
And so, I believe that there's hope for the future under proper dedicated management.
Yeah.
And I think that is the key. If those parks become a larder or a pantry for the government body, if they're profiting from poaching and bushmeat and everything, well, the park will die. But I think we're moving into a new era. I think we internationally. And I think that COVID might have had something to do with that. A realization and gratitude for our wild places, of which Africa is right up there. And so I think that there's a rebirth, a realization that we need to save these places. I mean, we can talk about sunsets and elephants walking across the sunset and these beautiful panoramas. But what other continent is blessed with all this? So I believe that there's a new energy. The fact that, Jamnuti, that you are so constantly involved in this arena, it just tells you, yes, there's hope for the future. We just have to look after it and care for it.
Yeah. You honor me. Kingsley, I know that we strap for time. I could speak to you for hours and hours, and I enjoy it, and I treasure every conversation we have. So I want to say thank you so much for this conversation today. Thank you for coming online, and I wish we could have done this in person. And thank you so much for your message of hope for the future and for sharing your stories and your insights with us. I can't wait to see you again and shake your hand. And I'm climbing Kilimanjaro next year in the end of September.
Oh, God, yeah.
It's going to be my 4th time going up there. We're doing a
fantastic
climb to raise funding for Project Rhino, for grants and them.
Wonderful.
So, yeah, I look forward to you joining our team and coming up Kilimanjaro with us.
Well, we'll chat about that. But Jamluti, thanks for this occasion. Yes, next time, hopefully we'll be around a campfire with Wes and Grant and all those other great characters. Thanks for spending this time, and best of luck for the future.
Thank you, mate. And greetings to Sheila. Thank you so much.
Thank you.